Professor Sanderson, over to you.
Thank you. Well, up to this point, I've covered the verses of the text which are addressed to the principal deities of the system. The first, a veiled reference to Kala Sankarshini. The verses after that, four verses that follow, addressing the three core deities, which are aspects of Kala Sankarshini in this system, para, para, prana, para. And then the verse after that addressed to Ganesha, or Ganapati, which, as I tried to show, is a highly encoded expression of a prayer for enlightenment through the expansion of I consciousness, throwing off its limited ego and achieving full and all-embracing awareness, which was a tour de force on his part, but unfortunately at the cost of considerable ambiguity and a lot of head-scratching to try to work out exactly what he had in mind. And as you remember, I ventured to differ with Jayarata in his interpretation, which I think the difference really focuses on the interpretation of the word chakreshwarayitam, which occurs in a compound, which he took to mean the denominative in the sense of behaving like. So obeisance to Ganesha or Ganapati, may Ganapati aid me, he who is the center, the Lord of the wheel, who behaves like the Lord of the wheel, which is a very lame thing to say. What he should have seen is that it means obeisance to Ganapati, whose inner nature is to be transformed into this fully expanded I consciousness, not the contracted I consciousness, which is the starting point. And I gave you some passages from a wonderful but badly transmitted work called the Mahanaya Prakasha, published from Trivandrum, which explains the doctrine of the Krama, that the I awareness which arises in the end of any cognition, as when you say to yourself, as a silent mental statement, I perceive X, that I is, as it were, a conduit through which one can enter into fully expanded consciousness. So now, having completed his obeisance to the principal deities, he starts addressing the teachers of the tradition, of the traditions, I should say, which he sees as flowing into his system, the system that he elaborates in this great work, Tantrāloka. And he begins by addressing a prayer to Machanda. Now, Machanda is the Siddha, the perfected one, otherwise known as Matsyendra or Meenanatha. The meaning of Machanda is essentially the fisherman. Now, which is like saying the untouchable, because the fishermen were considered untouchable in traditional Indian society. And to have as the revealer of your scriptural corpus a fisherman is really one in the eye for Brahmanical orthodoxy, so to speak. It was saying that this system transcends Brahmanical concerns with the pure and the impure, the upper caste and the lower caste, by erecting into a position of preeminence a person who is no more or less than an antyaja, one of the lowest born, outside the four main caste categories. Someone at the end, at the bottom of the pile, one who doesn't, for example, benefit from cremation rites. Antyajas are generally buried rather than cremated. Contact with them was considered highly polluting. They were supposed to live outside the settlement of the caste communities and to come into it only to do their traditional functions, such as removal of ordure, fishing and other such activities. So we begin with a prayer to this strange figure, Lord Machanda, who seems to turn Brahmanical values on their head. And this is the 7th verse, the opening verses of Tantrāloka. Ragarunam granti bilavakirnam yojala matana vitana vritti kalom bitam bahyapate chakara stan mesa machanda vibhu prasannaha. So here we have a precative again, stat, stan me, sa machanda vibhu prasanna, literally may that Lord Machanda be favorable to me. Stan me sa machanda vibhu prasanna, or as I translated here, may the famed Lord Machanda favor me in my endeavor. I pray that he will favor me in my endeavor. That's the idea. And then the rest of the verse has two meanings. One referring, puzzlingly for anyone restricted to the Kashmirian literature, to his act as a fisherman, of drawing a net to land, and the other to esoteric or metaphysical matters. There are two levels of meaning here, one mythological and the other metaphysical. So I've distinguished these two meanings by putting them within angle brackets. And the one I give first is the literal meaning referring to the net. So I pray that the famed Lord Machanda will favor me in my endeavor. He who brought to land, Bahya Pate Chakara, who placed on the path outside, I brought to land, outside the water, his fishing net, Jalam, which is Raga Arunam, red with ruddle or pigment, Kalumbitam, artfully strung, Kalaya umbitam in the meaning of gumpitam, one of its meanings. So artfully strung, or skillfully strung, Artana Vitana Vritti, which extends wide and long in both directions. This is a rather banal thing to say about a net, but when you see something like that, you know that you're looking for a second meaning. And there's a slight awkwardness in the formulation. It's usually because the author is trying to, there's another meaning underneath which works more smoothly for that particular selection of syllables. We saw that, for example, in the first verse as well. It was a slight awkwardness of certain phrases which stimulates one to look for a second meaning. So it's long and wide, Atana Vitana Vritti, and full of knots and apertures. Well, nets are. Again, we seem to be in the realm of the banal here. Granti Bilava Kirnam. And now we have the second meaning. And you'll see that in my translation I've written who, now beginning to give the second meaning, and then put in square brackets the word thereby, indicating that the connection between the two meanings is that the first, the bringing the net to land, explains the second. And we'll see what this is in due course. Who thereby banished Bahya Pate Chakara, pushed to the outside, who thereby banished, by bringing this net to land, the ensnaring net, the jalam, of Maya, of differentiated existence. That is ragarnam, that glows red with attachment. Raga is an ontological category for the Shaivas. It is that by virtue of which souls wish to be immersed in sense experience. It's a generic attachment to sense experience. So it glows red with attachment to the objects of the senses, is kalombitam, here in the meaning permeated, umbitam here in the sense of permeated, by contracted agency. Kala is another ontological or ontic category for the Shaivas, and it is explained, I'll just let that go by. It is the function by virtue, we could define it as a limited power of action. It's the first product of the category Maya, by virtue of which souls are able to act in a limited universe or contracted universe. So it's permeated by contracted agency, and its atana vitana vritti. It functions, its functioning, its vritti is throughout the length and breadth of the universe, understand of the universe. So it's all pervasive. So this kala pervades the entire universe. It's the category which subsumes all other emanations that make up the differentiated universe. For the Siddhantikas, it's a material, unconscious entity which only differentiates itself under the stimulus of Shiva's will. For the Śākta Śaivas, however, it's simply an aspect of the dynamism of consciousness. Consciousness has this ability to limit itself, to appear to be limited by what it's not, facing it from the outside. Yeah. So if you think I'm outside you, you're wrong. Look at me in a different way. Yeah. And it is Granti Bila Avakirnam. Avakirnam, filled, pervaded, by Granti Bila. Let's say the apertures of the Granti, literally the knot. The Granti here is another ontic category. It's an aspect of Maya, and it was seen by the dualists particularly as a physical barrier through which the soul has to penetrate in order to achieve liberation. Of course, for Abhinavagupta, there are no material barriers to consciousness. But nonetheless, reality presents itself as though there were. It appears in that way, that there is this impassable barrier between the world of differentiation and the enlightened world of fully expanded consciousness, full eye awareness, purnahanta. So, okay, your doubts are not resolved. You can't understand why dragging a net to land should lead to this abolition of the net of Maya, the figurative net of Maya, the net of differentiated perception. The way the non-dualists in this tradition define Maya is bhinna vedya prata, the state of the manifestation prata of bhinna vedya, differentiated objects of perception, differentiated from each other and from the perceiver, who likewise, we, the perceivers, as we perceive the object, also perceive ourselves, not only as other than the object, but also other than other perceivers. So it's a world of multidimensional plurality. So what is the connection here? Well, there's no answer to that in the surviving literature of Kashmir. So I remember reading this verse with my teacher in Kashmir, and it was a conundrum. Why? What's fishing got to do with liberation? And the answer is found not in the surviving literature in Kashmir, which is considerably reduced during the medieval period, but is to be found in the very copious collections of Śaiva material found in the Kathmandu Valley. One of those works is called the Jnana Nirnaya, published under the title Kaula Jnana Nirnaya, a quite horrendously bad edition, by the way, by a certain scholar called Bagchi. There's hardly a single line in the text which makes any sense as edited. It's a shocking job. Should have been thrown back at him by the publisher, but never mind. I've got hold of the only surviving manuscript, and I can see his task was a considerable one, because it's written in a very low register of Sanskrit. One of the things you need to know about scriptural literature in general, but particularly Śaiva scriptural literature, especially the more Śākta division of it, is that it's not written in Paninian Sanskrit exactly. It's written in a much looser register of the language. And that leads to ambiguity and also considerable levels of scribal corruption as well, because the pundits copying these things are puzzled by the deviations that they encounter at every step from Paninian norms, and have a tendency to try to correct, but often wrongly, because scribes are working in a hurry and tend to be myopic. They don't step back as a scholar would and think about the context and now what's gone wrong here? This doesn't quite make sense. Ah, yes, this small change restores sense. This is probably correct. So they tend to be rather poor textual critics. So what one hopes for is not an intelligent scribe, but a faithful scribe, one who is almost the human equivalent of a photocopying machine. But of course, human beings being what they are, we all make mistakes. I do it all the time when copying. I just infuriate myself at my inability to copy what I can see in front of my eyes. I think most of us are like that. So the answer is to be found in the Jnana Nirnaya, and this work, which survives in an 11th century manuscript, is your item 3 on page 2. Extending onto, and the translation is on page 3. Now, I think in my last lecture, Professor Jakobsen asked about mythology in Śaivism. And I said boldly that basically there isn't any. That's the general rule, at least, that the Tantrikas like to see themselves as dealing with eternal realities. The Puranas deal with stories. The Tantras don't. But this is not entirely always the case. There are exceptions, and this is one of the outstanding exceptions, especially in the literature dealing with Siddhas, because Siddhas, as it were, are an intermediate category. They are, as it were, deity-like, but at the same time they act in the world. So there are often myths associated with individual Siddhas, and Machanda is no exception to that. So here we have this following passage, which I've tried to get into intelligible language in spite of the endless corruptions in the text. When I had gone with you, this is Shiva speaking, when I had gone with you to Chandradvipa, which is southern area of Bengal, on the Bay of Bengal, to impart the Kula teachings to you in secret, our son Kartikeya joined us, taking the form of Vatuka. Concealing himself, he stole the manuscript containing this gnosis, this secret knowledge. I cursed him strongly as a thief, O Devi. Then a verse has clearly been omitted, and I have reconstructed it tentatively, at least the meaning is clear. In his anger, he threw the manuscript into the ocean, and there it was swallowed by a fish. Don't ask why. Because we have to get a fisherman to get it back, is the answer. I went to the ocean, my dear, and by searching with clairvoyant gaze, caught the fish, opened its belly, extracted the manuscript that was in it, brought it home, put it in its scripture box, and kept it hidden. Recovers the manuscript, puts it in its Jnana Putta, that's an emendation, and hides it in his house. Then that same thief, Kartikeya, angry again, made a breach into my dwelling by means of a tunnel, found and removed the manuscript, and hurled it once more into the ocean. Why the doubling? It doesn't seem necessary. You'd have to understand all these phases in the development of the narrative, you'd have to have access to a large number of variants to explain why, for what reason, the narrator decided to double the process of throwing into the ocean. Anyway, so hurled it once more into the ocean. On this occasion, it was swallowed by a huge fish, 10 somethings in length. And no, the meaning is, the manuscript reads Koti, but 100 million units of any size are going to be far too big for any fish. So I tentatively thought it might be a dunda, which is a reasonable, it would make it like a whale-like. It would be a leviathan size. So swallowed by a huge fish, I then produced a net of power born from my anger, a Shakti Jalam. From within the 7 oceans, I caught it in the net and started to drag it ashore. Problem here, the oceans are not interconnected in Hindu mythology, so it presumably is only in one of the 7. But anyway, he drew it in from the 7 oceans, because there are 7 in this theory of concentric continents with separating oceans. I caught in the net and started to drag it ashore, but I couldn't bring it in because its strength was equal to mine. Equal to Shiva's? Made more powerful by the radiance of the gnosis within its belly, it could not be overcome even by the gods. The suggestion seems to be that the Śākta knowledge is stronger than Shiva. That is probably the encoded meaning here. Yeah, so made more powerful by the radiance of the knowledge within its belly, it could not be overcome even by the gods. So I threw off my Brahmanhood. At the moment he's in the form of a Brahmin, a caste known for its physical strength. I threw off my Brahmanhood and transformed myself into a fisherman. That fisherman was myself. I turned myself into a man of that lowly caste, a Kaivarta. I then landed the fish that I had caught with my net of power, opened its belly again, and recovered the Kula scripture, the Kulagama. So here's the connection. It's the Kula discovery of the recovery of the Kula scripture, the Kula revelation, that banishes the figurative net of Maya by freeing us from, providing the most effective way of freeing us from the net of Maya. Now, implicit there is the idea that the Kala revelation is not only superior to the Brahmanical, but also implicitly to mainstream Śaiva revelation, that this is a special, ultra-powerful form of practice within the Śaiva category, transcending the mainstream of Siddhantika and related forms of worship. And so on your handout, on the first page, under item 1 after verse 7, you see the words with which Abhinavagupta begins his treatment of the Kula system. And he distinguishes, or rather Jayarata distinguishes, and to some extent Abhinavagupta, between what he calls a Tantra Prakriya. Don't worry, I'll get out of the way in a moment, we can see it properly. Tantra Prakriya and a Kula Prakriya, which can be translated approximately a Tantra system, Prakriya, and a Kula system. So he teaches the Trika as having these two levels, a Kaula level, the Kula Prakriya, and a Tantrika level, which he calls the Tantra Prakriya. So look, see what he says here. Attasamujitari karma udishya rahasya uchitetra vidi. Next, in this work, I shall teach the secret rites for those who are properly qualified. That is to say, I shall explain next this entire course of worship following the Kula system, Kula Prakriyaya, which is secret because it is suitable only for those gurus and disciples who are at the highest level of spiritual attainment. Parameshvara himself has taught that the subject of this highest teaching is the mode of worship adopted in the Kaula tradition of the Siddhas, Krama Pujane. Now that might be misunderstood to mean in the worship of the Krama, but the Krama here is the Siddha Krama, the order of Siddhas, which is another name here for the Kaula revelation. So Shiva has taught this, declaring, i.e. in the following words, even if one were to persist for thousands of years, one could not achieve using any or all of the numerous mantras of various kinds that are taught in the Tantra systems, what a person initiated into the tradition of the Siddhas, the Siddha Krama, can achieve in a single month. Now, actually, this is not the way Abhinavagupta wants to present things. This is a kind of rhetorical anti-Siddhantika rhetoric, because the standard view propagated by Abhinavagupta and his contemporaries is that all Shaivism works, and only Shaivism works in the sense of bestows perfect and definitive liberation. The difference is simply how quickly the liberation is achieved. So the Siddhanta achieves it for you at death. You have to take their word for it. Whereas the other systems promise its attainability, not necessarily that it will be attained, but the possibility of its being attained here and now in this life before death, through the achievement of Jivan Mukti, through direct mystical expansion of consciousness. So it seems a bit rough to say here that even if you go on for thousands of years, you're going to get nowhere with the regular mantra systems. That's against Abhinavagupta's view, which is simply dehapate mukti, liberation when the body falls, rather than right now, in this very life. So you can see here already one of the crucial aspects of Abhinavagupta's perspective is that it's inclusivist. He doesn't want to cut off this radical system from the more conventional mainstream forms of observance. Not only does he wish to preserve that, he also wishes to preserve some kind of congruity with Brahmanical observance as well. The whole thing is a multi-leveled system which works on every level in its way. He doesn't want to push anything out. Whereas if we go back to the scriptural sources, we find often a much more radical stance being taken. Yeah. The rest of religion is a waste of time, only this method works. The danger of taking that line is that you're likely to be arrested. You need to keep quiet about this perspective. I can give you a splendid historical example of this. There was a Kaula group in Kashmir in the around about the end of the 9th century, known as the Nilambara Vratins, the black blanket observance, the Nilambara Vratam. Naked couples wandered around in groups of naked couples, concealed from the public gaze only by black blankets. They wrap a black blanket around themselves, singing Apabhrangsha songs. And we get an example of this in the Agama Dambara of Jayanta Bhatta, who's satirizing this situation. Singing songs which basically say, drop out and turn on. Brahmanical religion is a waste of time. Stop wasting your time with the Vedas and all that nonsense. Leave the kitchen, join us. It's obviously particularly attractive to women. It is, according to the dramatist, this form of religion is seen as highly subversive. And a Brahmin observing this says, if this gets out too much, there won't be a single Brahmin woman in a kitchen anywhere. They'll all join the sect. So the sect is suppressed. And it's not just a dramatic fancy. We know from historical evidence that the ruling king of the time, Yashaskhara Varman, did suppress the sect. Declared it illegal, which led to a panic among the more left-directed Shaivas, that is to say the Śākta Śaivas, who started running for the frontier. And there's a wonderful episode in the drama in which two Karpalikas are hiding in the cremation ground, waiting for dark, so they can try to slip out of the country. Because they fear that if the Nilambara Vratyans are going to be arrested, then they will be too, because they say, well, they're just like us. We also drink wine, have congress with untouchable women, etc., etc. So there is this tradition of radical rejection of the norms. And Abhinavagupta is adopting a rather different approach, saying, yes, for those with the highest capacity, yes, in certain controlled environments, it is possible to transcend these regulations, consume wine, eat meat, and so forth. But you shouldn't let the dog off the leash. Everything should be kept under control. And we could say we could see a similar pattern in esoteric Buddhism in Tibet. Certain groups are actually stamped on by imperial authorities because they seem to be getting out of control. The important thing was to bring it inside monastic control if you can. So there may be secret practices going on in certain contexts, but the framework is there holding it in. So although there's a rhetoric of transcendence of all norms, nonetheless the norms hold. You're not subverting society itself. So Abhinavagupta is going for a point of view which will enable those who adhere to these esoteric practices to be seen nonetheless as having authority over the whole apparatus of the religion, all the way down through the Siddhanta into the Brahmanical zone. He was largely successful in that effort, I think, in Kashmir. And then there's another passage on page 2, on item 2 there, again from Tantrāloka of this 29th book, which deals with the Kula Prakriya. After having set out the regular worship according to the Kula, he then moves on to initiation, and he says, after first completing the preliminary Kaula worship in this way, a guru may then proceed to initiate a disciple of his into this elevated tradition, provided that he is that extremely rare person who possesses the requisite level of aptitude. And the word I've translated as extremely rare is Lakshaikiya, which means literally like 1 in 100,000. So it means a very rare individual. So unless you have 100,000 pupils, you're not likely to have any of them qualifying to be initiated into Kula. That's a rhetorical exaggeration, of course. So because the Kula is seen as superior to the Tantra Prakriya, he begins by adoring, or by appealing to, by praying to Machanda as the revealer of the Kula system, revealer of the Kula system in the current Kali Yuga, the age of Kali. There are in fact 4 natas in this system, one for each of the yugas. And Machanda is the yuga, is the Siddha who reveals the Kula in the present degenerate age, which began in, what was it, 3201 BC? According to the calculations of astronomers, based not on historical data, but on astronomical considerations. So that's why we begin with Machanda. Now, there are other sources which narrate this myth of the extraction of the Kula scripture from the fish by Machanda, but they occur in texts of the Paschima Amnaya, which is another Kaula tradition, and there they've taken over this myth, but somehow subsumed it into their own sectarian environment by saying it's not Machanda who drew the fish to land, it's Mitranata, whom they have substituted as their super Siddha, their presiding Siddha that govern the tradition. So Mitranata is the figure in your handout number 5, item 5 on page 3, near the bottom. I think, yes. This is a passage taken from an unpublished work called the Kula Ratnodhyota, the luminosity of the jewel of the Kula, and it's a dialogue between Adinata and the goddess, Adinata being a sort of Shiva embodiment, and Adinata replied, "In the future, a partial incarnation of Parvati will be born, and she will give birth to a son, the six-faced god Kartikeya. During the course of her embodiment in this form, Mitranata will teach the Jnana Nirnaya to her as his consort." Jnana Nirnaya, remember, is the text I translated earlier. "Doing so in private, but he will not teach it to his son Kartikeya, who, out of his anger, will hurl the manuscript of the text into the sea." Same story again. "Where it will be swallowed by a fish. My beloved Mahamaya, in its belly there will arise a great Siddha, produced by the force of divine empowerment, who will devote himself to the study of that text." Suddenly he finds himself inside the Leviathan, and he discovers the text there, and he starts to study it. "Having realized, my beloved, by means of the supernatural power achieved through meditation, that his son had thrown the manuscript into the sea, Mitranata, the king of Siddhas, will quickly draw that fish to land with his net of power, cut open its belly, and see within it a supremely radiant Siddha studying the text. After witnessing this great and unprecedented wonder, he will say, 'I have witnessed an astonishing miracle. Because you have been reborn from within the belly of the fish, you will be known henceforth as Matsyendra, Lord of Fish. This greatness of yours will be unsurpassed. This fame that will be yours as a result of this miracle will spread throughout the world, and the spiritual lineage that will descend from you, dear child, will be known as the Eastern lineage, the Purvamnaya. It will be, as it were, the mirror image of the Western path, the already existing, according to this text, Paschimamnaya. It will be adorned with all the divisions of the Ananda and the Avali. That's technical stuff we needn't worry about. So this text belongs to the Paschimamnaya, which actually came into existence after the Purvamnaya. The Paschimamnaya is heavily parasitic on the scriptural corpus of the Trika, which I'll show you is connected with the Purvamnaya presently. But, of course, it's very important to be earlier than your rivals. You're the original revelation, they're a secondary development. The secondary development is being given some status here. It's like a mirror image of the Paschima, but it's being presented as derivative, a mere image of the original revelation. This is the opposite of the historical truth. The Purvamnaya is the earlier form of Kaulism. The Paschimamnaya is an elaboration or a subsequent form of the tradition. So I can't dwell on this at great length here, but I just want to point out that we have two Paschimamnaya sources, this Kula Ratnodhyota and another called the Chinchini Matasara Samuchya, which give an account of the Purvamnaya. And that account of the Purvamnaya matches very closely what we see in the Kula system of the Trika, as taught in the 29th book of Tantrāloka. So we have here a development of 4 amnayas within Kaulism. Purvamnaya, you see they're differentiated by the cardinal directions. The Eastern tradition, the Uttaramnaya, the Northern tradition, Amnaya meaning tradition here, synonym Anvaya, so Purvanvaya, Uttaranvaya, Paschima, sorry, I'm hopeless at writing on boards. Okay. Paschimamnaya, and finally Dakshinamnaya, the southern transmission. Now only the Chinchini Mata gives an account of all 4. The Purvamnaya account of the Siddhas matches very closely what we find in Tantrāloka. The Uttaramnaya is the system which is approximately identical with the Krama, which inherits the Siddha Krama of the Purvamnaya. The same Siddhas are venerated in their worship, but actually has a very different character. This system, the Purvamnaya, reacts against the Karpalika background of all these rather extreme forms of Śākta worship, and insists that it's only by concealing your sectarian identity that you can achieve enlightenment in this system. Adrishtalinginam drishtva sambhashanti marichya. The rays of consciousness converge and enlighten you only when they see that you are without visible sign of sectarian affiliation. You have to be concealed, an idea also found in the Pashupata tradition, the invisible saint who attracts abuse from the public but is actually pure and untainted by desire and so forth. Whereas the Uttaramnaya has absorbed this Kaula tradition from the Purvamnaya, but still adheres very strongly to Karpalika observance. We have a lineage text from Kashmir of the masters of this tradition, historical lineage text, in which several of them are said to be Mahavrata Dara, observing the Karpalika Mahavrata, including some women, by the way. It's rather unique in that regard, that it has female gurus as well. So what we see here is a Kula system, an early Kula system, which has been adopted and taken up by various sectarian groups who have their own distinctive deities and haven't surrendered their distinctive practices, but have absorbed this into their own liturgies and their own self-identification. As for the Paschimamnaya, I think I've already mentioned, this is the cult of Kubjika, the goddess Kubjika is taught in the Paschimamnaya, and it's very heavily parasitic upon the Trika scriptures. It seems to have come into existence in Karnataka, which is indirect evidence that the Trika was flourishing in that area because it's built upon a Trika foundation. But it represents a very self-conscious departure from the Purvamnaya by introducing a completely different system of siddhas. And the Dakshinamnaya, according to the Chinchanimata, which is giving this account of all four, the Dakshinamnaya is kind of proto-Tripura Sundari cult. It's not identical with the Tripura Sundari cult. It's a kind of antecedent of it. The goddess is the same, Tripura or Kameshwari, but her retinue is different. This is not the mature Tripura Sundari cult. And that has a lot in common with the Paschimamnaya. Just to mention a couple of features, it's only in the Paschimamnaya and in the Dakshinamnaya, in the Tripura Sundari cult, that we see the system of 6 chakras, the classic system of 6 chakras, beginning with Muladhara, Swadhisthana, and so forth. That's not found in these earlier systems. It later became completely standard, and it almost constitutes a kind of tantric physiology, the belief that these really objectively exist. But if you were to speak to an adherent of the Purvamnaya or the Krama, what 6 chakras? You know, there are various centers which are used in meditation, but they move around and are different in number depending upon the correlations that are made in the meditation between these centers, the syllables of mantras and various other structures. It's a much more labile, flexible system in the early. Later on it all gets, as it were, objectivated. And now, of course, in modern forms of yoga practice, you know, these chakras really have come to exist as objective entities. You can buy fragrances which will activate one or the other, or reorient it. What's the word? I forget they use it. What is their rhetoric? Somehow they're reoriented or balanced, for you. And you can buy these fragrances for only £30 a bottle, one for each chakra. Look online. You see there's a huge industry which exists around these chakras, which were introduced in our evidence first in the Paschimamnaya and then became standard in the Tripura Sundari cult, which became extremely widespread in India, and as a result they now exist universally in the language of yoga. Right. Just for your information, on page 5 you have a list there of the Siddha Krama, the Siddhas of this tradition, one for each yuga. So Khagendranatha and his consort Vijamba in the Krita Yuga, the first, the Golden Age. Each of these, in the first 3 yugas, has 2 sons, and each of them has a duty. A duty means a female companion, so they're married couples, if you like, although I think there's no reference to formal marriage here. And only in the last under number 4, you'll see Machandanata and Kunkunamba. In the Tantrāloka manuscript, she's called Kunkuna, but it should be understood that that's synonymous with Konkana, so it means the princess of Konkan, from the coastal strip of Maharashtra, going down towards Kerala, Konkana, which is in the same area that the Paschimamnaya was flourishing. And that too seemed to be particularly fertile. They had 12 sons, known as the Rajaputras, the princes, and of whom 6 are qualified for the Kula and 6 are not. The disqualified ones are disqualified on the grounds that they are urdvaretasa. Their semen is up, that's to say, they are celibate. So there are 6 non-celibate sons who are the source of 6 separate ascetic lineages. Well, ascetic is perhaps not quite the right word. Antinomian, peripatetic yogis, you could say. The other 6 don't come into the picture. They're niradhikara because they're celibate. Again, one wants to know why exactly, but one would need to have access to an archive of mythological narrative, which we don't have access to anymore. The prescription survives, the mythology on the whole does not. Yeah. Now, I argue in my commentary at great length talk at great length about the connection between the Purvamnaya and the Trika. And in the next, which I won't go into here in any detail, but you will see in the next item here, at the very bottom of page 5, I talk about a connection between the Trika's Kula Prakriya and the Purvamnaya, and I point out that there is evidence in Kashmir itself of an understanding of this connection. In later times, the connection between the Purvamnaya and the Trika was completely forgotten. If you look at Nepalese accounts of the amnayas, for example, or any later East Indian accounts, the Purvamnaya and the Dakshinamnaya have, as it were, fallen into abeyance. Only the identity of the Uttaramnaya and the Paschimamnaya is remembered, that this is the kind of Kali cult and this is the Kubjika cult. So these are just dead letters, the Purvamnaya and the Paschimamnaya, the Dakshinamnaya, and so they fill them with imaginary deities. In the system found in the Tantra, for example, in Nepal, they've invented a goddess who has no independent cult for each of these 2, to complete the set, as it were. But the Kashmirians, who were isolated from the rest of India for several centuries until the Mughal period, they basically shut the border. And as a result, we're the beneficiaries of an extraordinary conservatism in their manuscript traditions. So they didn't receive the Vulgate influences from North India at all for several centuries. So they have recalled this initial connection, which I reached through analysis. They've actually recorded it. I found it recognized here and there in their ritual manuals, which are largely anonymous, but they were used by tantric officiants in Kashmir until recent times. And you'll see there, under that item 7, some evidence from this anonymous corpus of ritual manuals, the sort of literature that tends to get overlooked by indulgers because it's not, Mandarin culture, it's sort of run-of-the-mill stuff. But actually there's quite a lot of good scholarship in it too. So here's a verse which begins, introduced with the words, Atta Purvamnaye Malni Mantra Pujanam. Now in this long worship it's describing, you should worship the mantra of Malini, that's a Trika mantra, according to the Purvamnaya. And some variants say, worship the Purvamnayeshwari, the goddess who presides over the Purvamnaya. And it says, in a rather elegant verse, Atmendu dhamani yogesha naresha putra chitram trishula biladhamani shrishta shaktim vaisargake cha chitidhamani pundarikam kanchit param trikaparam pranamami shaktim. I bow before the goddess Para, the inexpressible one, Kanchit, white Shakti beyond the triad, adorned by the presence in her retinue of the lords of the ages, those 4 siddhas of the yugas, the yoganatas, here called Yogesha, the lords of the ages and the princes, Naresha, that's Rajaputra. I think it's Naresha, yes. Yogesha Naresha Putra, Naresha Putra. Naresha means king, Putra is Putra, so Naresha Putra is a periphrasis for Raja Putra, which is the prose name of those 6 qualified sons that are the source of the 6 cardinal lineages. So I bow before the goddess Para, the inexpressible white Shakti beyond the triad, adorned by the presence in her retinue of the lords of the ages and the princes. She emits her power in the moon center that is the self. That's code for S, letter S. In the fontanelle that is the trident, that's Au, because the letter it looks like a trident in Sharada script, Au. So it's code for, well, I shouldn't say Sharada, I should say late Brahmi, North Indian development of Brahmi script. And 3, in the ground of consciousness whose nature is emission. This gives you the 3 syllables, the 3 elements, which make up the root mantra of the goddess Para, Sau. And I've given you other examples there. You can look at them at your leisure. But one thing worth noting here is that you've got here in front of you almost the only evidence that exists of the survival of the Trika among the Kashmirian Brahmins. Apart from the fact they have manuscripts of the Tantrāloka and related works and continue to study them, they do not seem to have maintained in a vigorous way the ritual system of the Trika. If you want to know what was important, what the Tantra cults that were really vigorous in Kashmir, you look at the ritual manuals, which are largely syncretistic, in fact. So most of the cults that ever had any real force go into the mix. And the Trika is really marginal. The cult is essentially the cult of Swachanda Bhairava and Netranata, the deity of the Mrityunjaya Tantra. The cult of the Pichu Mata, the Brahmayama, is also present. And there are strong elements of the Kali cult in them, various deities brought in from the Jayadratiyamna, etc. But the Kubjika and Para, the deities of the Purva and Paschimamnaya, have a marginal presence, which I think tells us something. That this cult had its day, actually beginning in the 9th century, I think, but faded out. Except that Tantrāloka was such an impressive work on a theoretical level that people continue to study it, though they didn't actually take initiation into its rituals. They were worshipping Tripura Sundari predominantly, not Para. So the ritual system changes, but the theoretical orientation is maintained. As a result, unfortunately for me, most manuscripts of Tantrāloka only cover the purely theoretical first chapters. Once you get into the nitty-gritty of ritual, fewer and fewer manuscripts contain those later chapters. So, for example, we have one manuscript from South India. I have access to one manuscript from South India, a Malayalam script manuscript, which contains only the first 7 chapters. Now, you think, oh, the rest of it's been lost? No, I think they only copied the first 7. That seems more reasonable, because they form a unit. After that, it begins to get very technical. And the technicalities pertain to ritual, rather than to gnosis or yoga. So once you've got past gnosis and yoga, never mind about the rest. We'll just go on with Tripura Sundari worship or whatever we're doing, or Swachanda Bhairava worship. So that's an interesting situation. One should not be fooled by the existence of a text like the Tantrāloka into thinking everyone was a worshipper of the Trika. It seems to be in a very minor cult. There is, in fact, a sept of Brahmins among the Kashmirian Brahmins who have the family name Tiku. You may have encountered it. There's a very wealthy shipping magnate called Tiku. In Sanskrit, they're known as the Trika Jatiya, those who belong to the Trika sept or Jati. And you might expect them to keep going the Trika worship. No, they're worshippers of Tripura Sundari, which has connections with the Trika, but is not the same. Okay, so much for that. Yeah. Now, I pointed out that there's a strong connection, in my view, between the Purvamnaya and the Trika. But it's not exactly the case that there's identity between the Purvamnaya as recorded in the Kularatnodjota and the Chinchanimata on the one hand, and Tantrāloka on the other. So one asks oneself, I ask myself at least, is the Purvamnaya simply the Kula system of the Trika under another name, as those references in the ritual manual seem to imply? I think it isn't. For while Abhinavagupta's account of the Kula system's Siddha pantheon is very close to that of the Purvamnaya found in those Paschimamnaya sources, the material that is common to the three sources that I've looked at does not include all the signatures of the Trika as we know it from Abhinavagupta's work. We lack the three goddesses, Para, 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 and Apara, for example. So there are a number of deficiencies there. If you expect to find the full pantheon of the Trika inside the Purvamnaya, you will be disappointed. It's clearly the substrate, but not the whole show. So how do we explain this disjunction? Well, through history, I suppose, and change and development. The most plausible explanation of this disjunction is the hypothesis that the Kula associated with the Siddha Machanda was originally an independent tradition, and that at some point a current within the Trika, and there were several, adopted a variant of that tradition close to that which we have seen in the Purvamnaya as outlined in the sources of the Paschimamnaya, and in doing so began to assimilate it by inserting its own distinctive system of mantra deities into this framework. So this is expressed in the mandala, which is taught for the Kula worship in the Tantrāloka. One is to worship the Siddhas, their consorts and their offspring along the four sides of an enclosing square, and then the distinctive deities of the Trika are then installed within that matrix, added to it. And you can read that on the handout in more detail. So it seems to me that the process of this assimilation of the Purvamnaya that culminated in the Tantrāloka, that in this process the Kula system underwent a profound change, or rather developed more subtle forms that were added to and probably rubbed shoulders with their less sophisticated, less intellectualized antecedents. The evidence of the Purvamnaya from sources other than the Tantrāloka and the ritual manuals of Kashmir, which certainly postdate the Tantrāloka, create an impression of lineages of itinerant, non-celibate antinomian yogins outside the Brahmanical social order, wandering from one sacred Śākta site to another in search of revelatory encounters with yoginis. This is far from the sedentary and learned world in which Abhinavagupta was operating. I don't see him as an antinomian ascetic wandering from Devi Kota and, such places. Yeah. Indeed, if we wish to imagine how such a tradition might have looked before its absorption and elevation, we should look to the non-Brahmin, semi-itinerant yogins of the still-living Nat Sampradaya, which, although it has moved away from its Kaula antecedent in some respects, nonetheless preserves much of its character. Just about a little footnote here about the connection between the Nata Sampradaya and Kaulism. If you want iconography of Matsyendra, look to the Nat Sampradaya. They introduced Matsyendra as the guru of Gorakhnath, and he's represented sitting on a fish. And there are many representations of him in Karnataka. The cult became really big in the 12th and 13th centuries. There are many caves that were originally Buddhist, taken over by the Natas, and they've sculpted on the walls of these cave dwellings images of Matsyendra, etc., sitting on the fish. Sometimes the fish is also swallowing a little human being, which is clearly, again, Matsyendra. So the mythology is alive and well, and they are, in fact, worshippers of Kubjika and Tripura Sundari. So they may not, who knows, but they may not be doing the full Kaula worship anymore, but their mantras, their pantheon, and much of their itinerant practice is very strongly redolent of this Kaula form. Their initiation names also. In the Kula system of the Purvamnaya and the Uttaramnaya, males have names ending in Nata, and females names ending in Ayi. This is also the case. This is a commonality between these early Kaula systems and the Natas. There's a lot in common there. Yeah. So, so of course, Abhinavagupta's Kaulism presents a much more aristocratic face, a very different face. It looks to the older tradition of Kshatriya asceticism and understands its nature. He's not underinformed. He knows what the texts are saying. But his Kaulism is engaged in rationalizing all that in ways that invite the transcendence of the externals that define and sustain the original tradition. This, by the way, was by no means the work of Abhinavagupta and his near contemporaries alone. He's at the end of a process. The move away from visionary yoga and itinerant asceticism is already evident within the Trika's scripture Viravali. There's a work which actually doesn't survive independently, but is much quoted, called the Viravali, Garland of Heroes, Viravali, actually a name for a certain order of the alphabet, I think. The Viravali, which already shows in a rather strong form the idea that yes, there is all that outer stuff, which we call the Kula, but there's also the Kaula, the essence of the Kula. The word Kaula is now used in Kule Bhavam Akulatma Kaulam. Kaula is that within the Kula which transcends the Kula, which is beyond the Kula, which is transcendent. So this esoteric movement within the Kaula ascetic antinomian tradition pushed away externals, made the carrying of the katwanga and the skull bowl illegal, as it were, forbade it, and emphasized a transcendence of ritual. So in initiation, for example, the Viravali propagates a system of direct transmission, so mystical transmission from guru to disciple for highly competent or suggestible or advanced disciples, rather than elaborate ritual procedure involving fire and offerings. Direct transmission in which the guru merges his sense organs, he says, with that of the disciple, so they become one fused entity. And as a result of that, the initiand feels that he has been somehow internally transformed. So what Abhinavagupta is doing is not entirely original. He's simply giving it a much more thorough theoretical, philosophical, metaphysical foundation. As it were, making all this intelligible to learned Shaiva Brahmins who have no intention of wandering around India from sacred Pita to sacred Pita, but wish to internalize this and bring it from the cremation ground into the sitting room, or if you like, the bedroom. Now, this trend was fortified by the development in 10th century Kashmir of a tradition of rational argument by Abhinavagupta's predecessors, Somananda and Utpaladeva. Utpaladeva flourished approximately 925 to 975, and Somananda approximately 25 years earlier. We have no objective data for their dates. And this philosophical development, this tradition of rational argument defending Shaiva non-dualism, introduced a degree of intellectual refinement in the service of enlightenment that pervades and transforms Abhinavagupta's treatment of all aspects of the Trika that he will present in this monumental work, of which we're seeing the very beginning. And it is to acknowledge this philosophical tradition that he turns now, suggesting by the fact that he does so only after he has prayed for the favor of the fisherman Siddha of the Kali age, that it is the non-dual experience and the practice of non-duality through the transcendence or the throwing off of Brahmanical values and hierarchies, symbolized by Machanda, that form the core of Śākta Śaivism. The path of philosophical analysis, or tarka, being subservient to direct intuition and justifiable only as a means of provoking that intuition through reasoned elimination of false views. It's easy to read these philosophical texts of Somananda and Utpaladeva and the commentaries by Abhinavagupta as pure philosophy. He doesn't see it like that. This is a means of liberation through those who have the intellectual capacity to intuit ultimate reality through the removal of false views, to use their intellects to remove false views, and then to see what's left. Not merely as an intellectual exercise, as it were. So it was as if someone were to say to Bishop Berkeley, okay, you say the external world doesn't exist. Do you experience it like that? Or is it just a philosophical theory that you articulate in your common room or in your publications? What difference does it make to your perception? Abhinavagupta's view is an idea of dynamic non-dualism of consciousness, but it's supposed to transform the way you experience the world. And it's that transformation which is enlightenment. So it's a rationalization that also includes a rational account of how one could be enlightened without having to engage in a lifelong commitment to ritual and other such things. So here is verse 8, in which he addresses this philosophical tradition, or the gurus of this philosophical tradition. And that's at the top of page 9, second line, verse 8. Triambaka santati tamraparni sanmuktika prakarakanti vishesha vaja purve jayanti guravo gurushastra sindhu kalola keli kalalamala karnadhara. Jayanti. Now, Jayanti. If you look in virtually every translation of Sanskrit Namaskara verses, you will see this translated as they conquer. No, it doesn't mean that. It can mean to conquer, but it also means to be supreme. Not to conquer, it doesn't have an object. So the way commentators gloss Jayanti is sarvot karshena bhavanti or vartante. They are beyond everyone else. Supreme are would be the correct translation of Jayanti, not victorious is. What does it mean, victorious is Shiva? It introduces a martial element which is not intended. It just means greater than all others is the deity of your adoration. So supreme are the gurus, in this case it's the gurus, of the Trayambaka lineage, Trayambaka Abhihita Santati, the lineage Santati which is called Abhihita Trayambaka, the lineage of Triambaka, who, those untainted helmsmen, Karnadara, who have navigated before me through the surging waves of the ocean of the teachings of the Master. The Master is Sri Kanta, the Rudra who is the manifestation of Shiva responsible for spreading the Śaiva teachings. He is to be found on Mount Kailasa, according to Śaiva mythology. I liken their line to the Tamraparni river, and those gurus to its finest pearls, so great is their luster. You need to appreciate this verse, you need to know a number of things. One of them is where the Tamraparni river is. The Tamraparni river rises in the far south of the subcontinent in the Agastya Kutam peak in the Western Ghats, flows through South India and comes out into the Gulf of Mannar, looking at Ceylon. And at the mouth of the river, in the Gulf of Mannar, are famous oyster beds, which have been the main source of pearls throughout the world until the development of artificially cultivated pearls. And you also need to know that pearls were of fantastic value. I mean, they were extraordinarily expensive. I forget, I have some data somewhere in my commentary, but we have from the Roman world evidence that pawning one pearl was sufficient to fund an entire war. They were really very valuable indeed. They may have been a bit cheaper in India itself, possibly. Special for you, a special price. But if they could sell them for 6 million sesterci to Romans, why would they sell them any less to anyone else? Yes, you are my brother. I give you a special price. Yeah, we've all heard that one. Anyway, they were fantastically valuable. So to compare these gurus to pearls is to really stress enormous appreciation of their worth. I won't go into the physiology as understood of the generation of pearls, but it's basically the idea that the river water from the Tamraparni goes into the ocean where the oysters are and enter into the oysters and fertilize them. And from that the pearls grow. There are many accounts of these oyster beds, including in Marco Polo's travels, where it's explained that, and some Greek sources as well, where it's explained that the pearls are gathered by condemned criminals. There's a place absolutely seething with sharks. So you couldn't get ordinary people to go in there. And they had mantra specialists whose job it was to keep the sharks at bay while these unfortunates were gathering the pearls. Anyway, that's what the texts say. Whether it's true or not, I can't say. If you go online and look up sharks, there's plenty of information there. And it seems to fall into two camps. The one is sharks, no problem at all. It's totally exaggerated. They're friendly, lovable creatures. And the other kind is endless accounts of shark attacks. There's a very ambiguous view of sharks at the moment. I'm afraid I climb to the second view. I wouldn't be hesitant to jump into the Gulf of Mannar, and, at present at least. So here he's addressing the gurus of the Triambaka lineage, as it's called. And in the next passage that you have there on your handout, beginning on page 9, the lower part of the text, and going on for some time, is a critical edition that I prepared of a rather strange passage, which most people have discovered only at the end, which most people know, only because it forms the end of the Shiva Drishti of Somananda, in which Somanda is giving an account of his own lineage. In other words, the lineage of the Triambakas, those who follow Triambaka. And I won't read it to you now, but if you're interested, you can read that. You can see how badly transmitted it is by the very large apparatus criticus underneath the Sanskrit text that I printed there. Hardly anything passes without comment. It's quite tricky. And exactly who wrote this and when it first came into circulation, I'm not sure. I think it probably wasn't Somananda, but it's possible it was, or he wrote a version of it which has circulated and been elaborated at different times. Okay. And that lineage begins with mythical sages, mythical rishis, who generate their offspring through the mind. We have generations of manasa putras, mentally created sons, go through several generations. And then if you look towards the end of that passage of the translation on page 11, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10, 4, maybe 8 lines down. His son achieved success in the same way. This continued through 14 siddhas, all of whom are created by producing sons in this manner. One day, the 15th such son, who was well versed in all the Shastras, through carnal desire and on his own initiative, approached a certain Brahmin and obtained from him his Brahmin daughter in marriage. So the first of them married, the 15th is the 15th, I think. He fathered a worthy son. In the course of his wanderings, that son came in time to Kashmir and settled here. His name was Sangamaditya. His son was Varshaditya. He fathered the venerable Arunaditya. Arunaditya fathered a worthy son called Ananda. I, Somananda, am the latter's worthy son, and have composed this treatise called Shiva Drishti. Thus I have explained this lineage, which bears the name Triambaka, and in the vernacular Teramba, which has now spread far and wide through the disciples of these gurus and the disciples of those. So after that I've given a passage from the South Indian source which includes that passage but then adds some further generations down to Kshemaraja. So the tradition was maintained. So Abhinavagupta sees himself as in a lineage which begins in the distant past on Mount Kailasa, where a command is given to a certain siddha because the tradition is dying out, regenerated, revivify this tradition, and this is the end of that long process. So just as the Tamraparni produces its wonderful pearls only at the end of its course when it reaches the ocean, so likewise I suspect this is the idea. This long line of gurus, which begins with Durvasas on Mount Kailasa, being addressed by Shiva, who tells him, Shrikanta, tells him now, come on, revivify this tradition. So likewise, that gives birth to these wonderful works of philosophical reasoning only at the very end of this long process of several about 20 generations down to the time of Somananda. And it's important that it's represented as extra Kashmirian. It comes into Kashmir only later in its course. So it's important. It's always been important to the Kashmiris, while exalting the glories of their nation, not to be seen as cut off from the pan-Brahmanical shared ecosphere, as it were. Always to be seen as part of Greater India. And their grounds for doing so are rather slender for the early period. A couple of references in the Mahabharata, which were probably interpolated, which talk about Kashmir as being a great center of tirthas and so forth. In the early centuries, Kashmir was a Buddhist place. I think it's only from the 4th century onwards that Brahmanism begins to show itself. It may have been there earlier, but it doesn't show itself until we get to the 4th and 5th centuries. Now, of course, I had ambitions to cover a lot more than I've done today, as you can see from this vast handout. But we'll return to this next week, not next week, 2 weeks from now, in the 4th lecture, where the emphasis will be on his teacher Bhuttiraja, who's a Krama master. But that must be postponed, I think, until the next lecture, since we're now at 3:14. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.